My name is David, and for 32 years I worked as a forest ranger in Olympic National Forest in Washington State. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what's really out there, lurking in those ancient woods where the mist never quite lifts and the trees grow so thick that noon feels like twilight. I transferred to Olympic in 1989 after spending 15 years in smaller parks down south. I thought I'd seen everything. Bear attacks, missing hikers, illegal hunters, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered during my third winter there. It started with the missing campers. Every few months, someone would vanish without a trace. Not unusual in itself, people underestimate the wilderness all the time. But these disappearances were different. We'd find their camps perfectly intact, food still warm over dying fires, sleeping bags laid out as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, nothing. The local Quinault tribe had stories about that part of the forest. They called it the Hungry Dark and refused to guide anyone into the deeper sections. The elder I spoke with, a weathered man named Joseph, told me that something had always lived in those woods, something that walked upright but wasn't human. He said it was tall as the trees and patient as death itself. I dismissed it as folklore until the night that changed everything. It was February 15th, 1992. A brutal winter storm had knocked out power to half the county, and I was making my rounds in the worst of it. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me, even with my headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw the distress flare, a bright red streak against the black sky coming from deep in the restricted section where no one was supposed to be camping. I radioed dispatch, but the storm was interfering with communications. All I got back was static. Protocol said to wait for backup, but whoever fired that flare was in trouble. And in weather like this, minutes could mean the difference between life and death. I grabbed my emergency pack and headed into the forest on foot. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind was howling through the trees like something alive and angry. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness just a few feet ahead of me, creating this eerie tunnel of visibility that made me feel like I was walking through a nightmare. About a mile in, I found them, or what was left of them. The campsite was destroyed, but not by the storm. The tent had been shredded from the outside, long gashes torn through the heavy canvas in parallel lines. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, half buried in the snow. But it was the silence that got to me first. In a storm like that, you expect to hear the wind, the creaking trees, something. But around that campsite, it was dead quiet, like the storm just stopped.
That's when I saw the tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot prints. And they had what looked like claw marks at the ends. But they were bipedal, walking upright like a man. The tracks led away from the campsite in a straight line, deeper into the forest where even I rarely ventured. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. But I could see something red in the snow ahead. Clothing, maybe a jacket. If there was a chance someone was still alive. I followed the tracks for maybe 200 yards before I found him. A young man, probably in his 20s, hanging from a Douglas fir, about 15 feet off the ground. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. He wasn't hanging from rope or wire. Something had wedged him into the crook of two branches, and he was positioned facing back toward the trail, like he was meant to be seen. As I stood there, trying to process what I was looking at, I heard breathing behind me. Slow, deliberate, and far too deep to be human. I turned around slowly, and my flashlight beam caught something that my mind still refuses to fully accept. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in coarse, dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in hands that looked human except for the claws, black, curved things that gleamed even in the weak beam of my flashlight. But the face, God help me, the face was the worst part. It had a human-like skull structure, but elongated, stretched out like someone had grabbed it at both ends and pulled. The eyes were sunken deep into the sockets, glowing with a dull yellow light that didn't seem natural. And when it opened its mouth, I saw rows of teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it did something that made my blood turn to ice water. It smiled. Not like an animal baring its teeth, but a deliberate, knowing smile, like it was enjoying the fear it saw in my eyes. It took a step toward me, and that broke the spell. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush, falling and getting back up, my lungs burning in the cold air. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, but walking with those impossibly long strides, always just close enough that I could hear its breathing, but never quite catching up. I made it back to my truck somehow and drove straight to the station without stopping. When backup arrived the next morning, they found the campsite and the body, but the tracks had been covered by fresh snow. The official report listed it as an animal attack, probably a bear defending territory. But I knew better, and apparently so did the creature, because for the next 3 months, I saw it watching me. Always at a distance, always at the edge of my vision, standing between the trees when I was on patrol, silhouetted against the skyline when I was driving the mountain roads. Never approaching, never threatening, just watching.
Other rangers started noticing changes in me. I stopped volunteering for the deep forest patrols. I refused to work alone. I started carrying extra ammunition and sleeping with the lights on. They thought I was having a breakdown, and maybe I was. The final straw came in May of that year. I was working late at the ranger station, finishing up some paperwork before heading home, when I heard scratching at the door. Slow, deliberate scratching, like something was trying to get in. I grabbed my sidearm and called out, asking who was there, but the only response was more scratching. I looked out the window and saw it, standing just at the edge of the light from the station, that same knowing smile on its face. But this time, it raised one of those clawed hands and waved at me. Actually waved, like we were old friends. That's when I knew it wasn't just some animal. Whatever this thing was, it was intelligent. It had been playing with me, following me, studying me, like I was some kind of experiment. And the worst part was I could see something in those glowing eyes that looked almost fond, like a pet owner looking at a favorite dog. I put in for early retirement the next week and moved as far from those forests as I could get. That was 30 years ago, and I've never been back. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night in my apartment here in Phoenix, I swear I can still hear that breathing outside my window. Slow and deliberate, and far too deep to be human. The Olympic National Forest is still there, and people still go missing in those woods. The official reports always blame bears or exposure or getting lost, but I know the truth. There's something in those trees that's older than the forest itself, something that sees humans as nothing more than another species to hunt. And the worst part, I think it's still out there, still watching, still waiting. Maybe it's found new ranges to play with, new games to enjoy. And maybe, just maybe, it's still looking for me. That's why I'm telling this story. Not because I want sympathy or because I think anyone will believe me, but because if you ever find yourself camping in Olympic National Forest, if you ever see tracks that are just a little too big to be human, if you ever feel like something is watching you from the tree line, run. Don't look back. Don't try to be brave. Just run as fast and as far as you can. because some things in this world are better left undiscovered. And that thing in the Olympic forest is definitely one of them.
My name is Sarah, and I spent 7 years working as a park ranger at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. What I'm about to tell you happened during my final month on the job, and it's the reason I'll never set foot in those woods again. I'd always been drawn to the remote assignments, the places where most rangers didn't want to work, while others preferred the visitor centers and popular hiking trails. I volunteered for the backcountry patrols, the overnight watches at isolated stations. There was something peaceful about being alone with nature, or at least that's what I thought until I learned that sometimes you're not as alone as you believe. It was October 2018 when I got assigned to investigate reports of illegal camping in the restricted area near Phantom Ship Island. The area had been closed to the public for months due to unstable cliff conditions, but hikers kept reporting seeing campfires and smoke coming from that direction. My supervisor, Tom Rodriguez, pulled me aside before I left. "Vera," he said, looking unusually serious, "I need you to be extra careful out there. We've had 3 separate reports in the past month of someone screaming for help near Phantom Ship. But every time we send a team, they find nothing. No campers, no signs of distress, nothing." I asked him what he thought was causing it, but he just shook his head and told me to trust my instincts. If something felt wrong, I should get out immediately and call for backup. Hike to Phantom Ship took me about 4 hours through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in the park. The weather was perfect, clear skies, cool mountain air, and that incredible view of the lake that never gets old, no matter how many times you see it. But as I got closer to the restricted area, something began to feel off. First thing I noticed was the silence. Crater Lake is never completely quiet. There's always wind, birds, the sound of water lapping against the rocks. But as I approached the coordinates where the smoke had been spotted, it was like someone had turned off all the natural sounds of the forest. And I saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from behind a cluster of old-growth pines, exactly where no one should have been camping. I radioed my position to dispatch and moved in to investigate. What I found was unlike anything in my 7 years as a ranger. There was indeed a campsite, but it looked like it had been there for months, maybe years. The tent was an old canvas military surplus model that looked like it came from the 1970s, weathered and patched, but still functional. A small fire was burning in a ring of carefully arranged stones, and hanging over it was a pot of what smelled like venison stew. And here's the thing that immediately set off alarm bells. The campsite was immaculate. Everything was organized with military precision, from the folded sleeping bag to the neatly arranged cooking supplies. It looked like the person who lived there took incredible pride in maintaining their space, which was strange for someone camping illegally in a restricted area. I called out, announcing myself as a park ranger and asking if anyone was present, but got no response. Following protocol, I began documenting the site with my camera while waiting to see if the camper would return. That's when I found the journal. It was sitting on a small folding table next to the tent, bound in weathered leather and filled with handwritten entries. The first page made my blood run cold. It was dated September 15th, 2003, 15 years earlier, and it was signed by Marcus Webb, retired Coast Guard, age 67. As I flipped through the pages, a horrifying story began to unfold. Marcus had been a lighthouse keeper for 30 years before retiring to the woods around Crater Lake. According to his entries, he had chosen this specific spot because because it reminded him of his lighthouse, isolated, peaceful, a place where he could watch over things. But watch over what? The journal didn't initially say. Entries from the first few years were mundane observations about weather, wildlife, his daily routines. But gradually, they began to change. He started writing about visitors, people who would stumble into his camp lost or injured. He described how he would help them, give them food and shelter, and guide them back to safety. Then the entries took a darker turn. March 3rd, 2007. Another lost hiker today. Young woman, maybe 25, hypothermic and delusional. I gave her warm food and my spare blanket. She kept asking about her boyfriend, said they got separated during a storm. I haven't seen any boyfriend. She's sleeping now. I'll help her find her way out tomorrow. March 4th, 2007. She tried to leave during the night. I couldn't let her go in her condition. She would have died in the cold. Had to restrain her for her own safety. She'll understand when she feels better. March 10th, 2007. She stopped asking about her boyfriend. I think she's beginning to appreciate what I'm doing for her. We had a nice conversation by the fire tonight. She even smiled. March 15th, 2007. She tried to run again today. I had to stop her. Why won't she understand that I'm trying to protect her? The woods are dangerous. She's safe here with me. The entries went on like this for weeks, describing how Marcus believed he was helping this woman by keeping her against her will. Then, abruptly, they stopped mentioning her altogether. The next entry was simply, "She's with the others now. They understand why I had to do it." My hands were shaking as I flipped through more pages. Over the years, Marcus had written about dozens of visitors, hikers, campers, even other park rangers who had stumbled across his camp. All of them lost or in danger, according to Marcus. All of them kept for their own safety. Most recent entries were from just 2 weeks earlier. October 1st, 2018. New visitor today. Park ranger, young woman with red hair. She was investigating reports of smoke from my camp. I watched her approach from the ridge. She seems capable, but the woods have been particularly dangerous lately. I may need to help her soon. October 5th, 2018. She's been back twice now, getting closer each time. I can tell she's dedicated to her job. That's admirable. I was dedicated once too, but dedication can be dangerous if you don't know what you're really dealing with out here. October 12th, 2018. She'll be back tomorrow. I can feel it. I've prepared a place for her with the others. She'll be safe there, away from the real dangers in these woods. She'll thank me eventually. They all do, in the end. I realized with horror that he was writing about me. Somehow, this man had been watching me, tracking my patrol routes, learning my patterns. And according to his journal, he was planning to help me just like he had helped all the others. I grabbed my radio to call for immediate backup. But before I could key the microphone, I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't read other people's private writings, young lady. That's not very polite." I spun around to see an elderly man emerging from the tree line. He was tall and lean, with a white beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed far too alert for someone his age. He was carrying an armload of firewood and smiling at me like we were old friends. "Must be Sarah," he continued, setting down the wood and brushing off his hands. "I've been looking forward to meeting you properly. You're very dedicated to your job. I admire that." I had my hand on my sidearm, but something about his calm demeanor made me hesitate. He seemed genuinely friendly, like a harmless old man who just happened to be camping illegally. But the journal entries were still fresh in my mind. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you're camping in a restricted area. I'm going to need you to pack up your belongings and come with me." Marcus shook his head sadly. "Oh, Sarah, you don't understand. You can't leave now. Not when you've seen so much. The woods are dangerous this time of year. Hypothermia, rock slides, all sorts of hazards. You could get hurt trying to make it back alone." He took a step closer, and I noticed for the first time that he was carrying something in his other hand, a length of rope, already fashioned into a loop. "I'm a lighthouse keeper, you see," he continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "It's my job to keep people safe, to guide them away from danger. And you, my dear, are in terrible danger out here all alone." I drew my weapon and ordered him to stop, but he just kept walking toward me with that same gentle smile. "The others were frightened at first too," he said, "but they came to understand. They appreciate the safety I provide. You will too, once you meet them." That's when I heard them, voices calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Help us," they were saying. "Please help us." At first, I thought it might be other campers in distress, but then I realized the voices all sounded weak, desperate, like people who had been calling for help for a very long time. Marcus heard them too, and his smile widened. "You see, they're welcoming you already. They know you belong with them." I fired a warning shot into the air and started backing away, but Marcus just kept coming. He moved with surprising speed for his age, and I realized that the gentle old man routine was just an act. This was someone who had been hunting people in these woods for 15 years, someone who had perfected his technique through practice. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, while behind me Marcus called out in that same calm, friendly voice, "Sarah, don't be afraid. I'm only trying to help you. The woods are dangerous alone." But the worst part was those other voices, getting fainter as I ran, but still audible. "Help us," they kept calling. "Please don't leave us here." I made it back to my vehicle and called for backup. But when the search team arrived the next day, they found nothing. No campsite, no journal, no signs that anyone had ever been there. The official report concluded that I had experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucination, but I know what I saw, what I read in that journal. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear those voices calling for help. Weak, desperate voices of people who trusted a friendly old man who promised to keep them safe. Really terrifying part is that Marcus was right about one thing. People do go missing in those woods. Every year, experienced hikers and even park rangers disappear without a trace. The official explanations are always natural causes: falls, exposure, animal attacks. But I wonder how many of them encountered a helpful lighthouse keeper who offered to guide them to safety, transferred to a desk job in Portland the next month, and never went back to Crater Lake. But I still think about those voices, about the people who might still be out there, kept safe by a man who believes he's protecting them from dangers that exist only in his mind. If you ever go hiking in remote areas, especially around Crater Lake, be careful of helpful strangers. And if you ever hear voices calling for help from deep in the forest, don't assume they're free to leave if you find them. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the wilderness itself, but the people who claim they want to protect you from it.
My name is Jake, and I worked as a trail maintenance specialist for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 12 years. I'm not a ranger exactly, but I spent more time alone in those woods than most people ever will. My job was to maintain the hiking trails, clear fallen trees, update trail markers, and report any unusual conditions to the Park Service. It was solitary work, which suited me perfectly. I thought I knew every inch of those mountains like the back of my hand. I was wrong.
It started in the summer of 2016 when I was assigned to restore a section of the Appalachian Trail that had been damaged by spring flooding. The area was about 8 miles from the nearest road, deep enough that most day hikers never made it that far. It was exactly the kind of remote, challenging work I preferred. I'd been working that section for 3 days when I encountered something that changed everything I thought I knew about those mountains. I was clearing debris from what should have been a straightforward stretch of trail when I noticed something odd about the trail markers. The familiar white blazes that marked the Appalachian Trail were there, but so were other markings I'd never seen before. They were carved in the trees rather than painted, deep gouges that looked old but somehow fresh at the same time. The symbols didn't match any official Park Service markings I knew, and I'd been trained on all of them. They looked almost like letters, but in an alphabet I couldn't recognize. More concerning was the fact that the trail itself seemed wrong somehow. I'd hiked this section dozens of times over the years, but it felt different. Turns that I remembered being gentle curves were now sharp switchbacks. A small creek that should have been on the left side of the trail was now on the right. Most unsettling of all, the trail seemed longer than it used to be, stretching further into the forest than my GPS indicated it should. I figured I was just getting disoriented. Happens to everyone occasionally, even experienced hikers. But when I tried to verify my location using the detailed topographical maps I always carried, I found something that made my blood run cold. According to my GPS and compass, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But according to the landscape around me, I was somewhere else entirely. That night, I camped at a designated backcountry site that should have been familiar to me. I'd stayed there at least a dozen times before, but when I arrived, the campsite was wrong. The fire ring was in a different location, the cleared area was smaller, and there was a large boulder in the center that I was certain had never been there before. I called my supervisor on the satellite radio, but the connection was poor. All I managed to get through was that I was experiencing some navigation issues and would radio again the next morning. What I didn't tell him was that I was starting to feel like I wasn't just lost. I was somewhere I'd never been before, despite all my maps and instruments insisting I was in familiar territory. The next morning, I decided to backtrack to a landmark I knew well, a distinctive rock formation called Eagle's Perch that overlooked a deep valley. I'd been there countless times, had eaten lunch sitting on that exact rock, had taken dozens of photos of the view. If I could just get back to Eagle's Perch, I could reorient myself and figure out what was going wrong. But when I reached the coordinates where Eagle's Perch should have been, I found something else entirely. Instead of the familiar rock outcropping, there was a perfectly circular clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure that looked like an altar or shrine, covered in the same strange carved symbols I'd seen on the trail markers.
I stood at the edge of that clearing for nearly an hour, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just being turned around or misreading a map. This was finding a completely different landscape in a place where I'd stood hundreds of times before. It was like someone had taken the familiar mountains I knew and replaced them with something else overnight. As I was examining the stone structure, trying to photograph the symbols for later research, I heard voices coming from the trail behind me. 2 hikers emerged from the tree line, a middle-aged couple with expensive gear and confident expressions. They looked like experienced backpackers who knew exactly where they were going. "Excuse me," the woman called out when she saw me. "Are we still on the Appalachian Trail? Our GPS is acting up, and we're trying to get to the Smoky Mountain shelter for tonight." I looked at her with what must have been complete bewilderment. There was no Smoky Mountain shelter anywhere near here. The nearest shelter was Charlie's Bunyan, which was 15 miles away, in completely the wrong direction. But according to their map, which they showed me, the Smoky Mountain shelter was supposed to be just 2 miles ahead. The problem was, their map showed the same topographical features as mine, the same elevations and landmarks, but it also showed features that didn't exist. Shelters, springs, even entire mountains that weren't on my maps. And according to their GPS, We were all standing in exactly the same location. That's when I realized we weren't just lost. We were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that looked like the Smoky Mountains but wasn't quite right. Like a copy that was almost perfect but contained subtle differences that added up to something completely alien. I tried to explain the situation to the couple, but they looked at me like I was suffering from altitude sickness. They consulted their own GPS devices, checked their maps, and insisted that everything was exactly as it should be. To them, the stone altar in the clearing was just an interesting rock formation. The carved symbols on the trees were just natural bark patterns. The Smoky Mountain shelter that didn't exist on my maps was clearly marked on theirs. We decided to travel together for safety, but as we hiked deeper into what should have been familiar territory, the discrepancies became more pronounced. Streams flowed uphill in defiance of gravity. The sun seemed to set in the wrong direction. Trail markers appeared and disappeared as we walked, like someone was constantly rearranging them just out of our sight. Most disturbing of all, we began encountering other hikers who all had slightly different maps, all showing the same basic area but with different features, different destinations, different interpretations of where we actually were. It was like we'd stumbled into a place where multiple versions of the Smoky Mountains existed simultaneously, all occupying the same physical space. By the third day, our group had grown to 8 people, all of us carrying maps that showed different versions of the same territory. Some maps showed shelters that others couldn't see. Some showed trails that led to destinations that didn't appear on anyone else's maps. We were all using the same GPS coordinates, all standing in the same physical location, but experiencing completely different landscapes. That's when I started finding the notebooks. They were hidden in hollow trees, tucked under rocks, left in places where only someone who was really looking would find them. All of them contained accounts similar to ours. Hikers, Park Service employees, even search and rescue teams who had found themselves in a version of the Smoky Mountains that didn't quite match reality. One notebook, written by a park ranger named Beth Morrison, described how she'd been tracking a missing hiker when she realized the trail she was following didn't appear on any official maps. She wrote about finding campsites that showed signs of recent use but didn't match any registered camping permits. She described encountering other searchers who were looking for completely different missing persons in what appeared to be the same location.
Another notebook belonged to a geologist who had come to study rock formations that appeared on satellite images but couldn't be found in the field. He wrote about taking soil samples that showed mineral compositions impossible for the Appalachian region, about finding fossils of creatures that had never existed in North America, about measuring elevation changes that violated basic laws of physics. But the most disturbing notebook was written by someone who claimed to be a trail maintenance worker like myself. The handwriting was familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. The account described experiences almost identical to mine, finding wrong trail markers, discovering landmarks that had moved or changed, encountering hikers with conflicting maps. It was only when I reached the last entry that I realized why the handwriting looked familiar. It was mine, not similar to mine, not someone with similar penmanship. It was exactly my handwriting, describing events I had no memory of experiencing. The final entry was dated 3 months in the future. Jake returned to the real Smokies today, but part of him stayed behind. Part of him will always be walking these shifting trails, trying to find his way back to a place that might not exist anymore. I wonder if he'll remember writing this when he finds it. I dropped the notebook like it was on fire and immediately tried to radio for help, but my satellite radio was only picking up broadcasts from park services that didn't exist, reporting conditions for trails that weren't on my maps, describing weather patterns that didn't match what I could see with my own eyes. That night, I made a decision. Instead of trying to navigate by maps or GPS, I would follow my instincts and try to find my way back to the version of the Smoky Mountains I remembered. I left the group, who were still debating which map was correct, and struck out on my own. It took me 4 days of walking, ignoring every trail marker and map reference, following only my gut feeling about which direction felt right. I passed through landscapes that shifted and changed as I walked, saw the same mountain from 3 different angles simultaneously, crossed streams that flowed in circles. Finally, on the 4th night, I made camp in a small clearing and woke up the next morning to find myself exactly where I was supposed to be according to my original work assignment. My GPS showed the correct coordinates, my maps matched the terrain, and Eagle's Perch was exactly where it should be, unchanged and familiar. I hiked out immediately and filed a report about equipment malfunction and navigation difficulties, but I never mentioned the shifting trails or the other hikers or the notebooks. Who would believe something like that? I certainly wouldn't have before I experienced it myself.
But I kept the notebook, the one written in my own handwriting describing events I couldn't remember. Sometimes I flip through it and read accounts of places I've never been, describing landmarks I've never seen, written in words I never wrote. The final entry is still there, still dated 3 months in the future from when I found it, still warning about a part of me that stayed behind. I quit trail maintenance after that and took a desk job with the Park Service. But sometimes when I'm looking at trail maps or planning hiking routes for visitors, I notice discrepancies. Trails that appear on some maps, but not others. Shelters that exist in the database but can't be found in the field. GPS coordinates that lead to empty spaces where something should be but isn't. And I wonder how many other people have found themselves walking the shifting trails, carrying maps to places that exist only sometimes, following markers that lead to destinations that might not be there when you arrive. How many hikers go missing not because they got lost in the mountains, but because the mountains themselves decided to be somewhere else? The Smoky Mountains are ancient, far older than human civilization, older than our maps and our understanding. Maybe they remember a time before we tried to pin them down with coordinates and trail markers. Maybe they resent being locked into our static version of reality. Or maybe there's something in those woods that enjoys watching us try to navigate landscapes that refuse to stay still, that feeds on our confusion and fear when familiar places become foreign and maps become worthless. All I know for certain is that somewhere out there, on trails that exist between the ones on our maps, other versions of me are still walking, still trying to find their way home to a place that might not exist anymore. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the me sitting here writing this is the real one, or just another lost hiker who never quite made it back.
My name is Alina, and for 8 years, I worked as a forest ranger in the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska. It's the largest national forest in the United States, covering over 17 million acres of temperate rainforest. And in all that vastness, there are places where you can go days without seeing another human being. I used to think that isolation was peaceful. Now I know better. This story takes place during the summer of 2019, when I was stationed at a remote outpost near Admiralty Island. My partner that season was supposed to be a veteran ranger named Miguel Santos, but he'd called in sick with what the doctors thought might be early-stage dementia. At 62, Miguel had been showing signs of memory problems, forgetting protocols he'd known for decades, getting lost on familiar trails, sometimes not recognizing colleagues he'd worked with for years. The official diagnosis was stress-related cognitive decline, but Miguel insisted something else was wrong. He kept talking about the trees, saying they were taking his memories, stealing pieces of his past. The Park Service eventually granted him medical leave, and I was left to cover our territory alone. Our sector included some of the oldest temperate rainforest in North America, with Sitka spruce and western hemlock trees that were ancient when the first Europeans reached Alaska. The Tlingit people who originally inhabited the area had always considered certain groves sacred, off limits to hunting or camping. They called them the the memory places, though none of the elders I spoke with would explain exactly what that meant. I dismissed it all as folklore, until I started experiencing the memory lapses myself. It began subtly, the way these things always do. I'd be hiking a trail I'd walked dozens of times, and suddenly not remember which turn led back to the ranger station. I'd radio dispatch to report my location and realize I couldn't recall what I'd been doing for the past few hours. Small things that I attributed to fatigue or stress from working alone in such a remote area. Then the gaps started getting bigger. I'd wake up in my cabin with no memory of the previous day, find detailed reports in my own handwriting describing patrols I couldn't remember taking. My equipment would be arranged differently than I remembered leaving it. My supplies depleted in ways that suggested I'd been out in the field for days when I could only account for hours. Most disturbing of all, I began finding photographs on my camera that I had no memory of taking. Pictures of tree groves I'd never seen, carved symbols on bark that looked Native American, but didn't match any traditional Tlingit designs I knew, and images of myself in locations I was certain I'd never visited. Breaking point came 3 weeks into my solo assignment. I woke up one morning to find my boots caked with mud from a specific type of soil that only existed in one part of our sector, a remote valley called Raven's Hollow that was considered sacred by the local Tlingit community and was technically off limits even to park service personnel. According to my GPS log, I'd never been to Raven's Hollow. According to my daily reports, I'd spent the previous day conducting routine maintenance near the visitor center, 20 miles away. But according to the evidence on my boots and the photographs on my camera, I'd not only been to Raven's Hollow, I'd spent considerable time there. Photos showed me walking deeper and deeper into a grove of massive old-growth trees, each image time-stamped throughout what should have been a normal workday. In the final photograph, I was standing in front of the largest Sitka spruce I'd ever seen, my hand pressed against its bark, with an expression on my face that I'd never seen before, a look of complete peace, as if I'd finally found something I'd been searching for my entire life. I had no memory of taking any of these pictures. I had no memory of going to Raven's Hollow. I had no memory of finding that tree or touching it or feeling whatever peace was captured on my face in that final photograph. At night, I called my supervisor and requested immediate backup, but the earliest anyone could reach my station was still 3 days away due to weather conditions. I was told to stay put, avoid any unnecessary patrols, and wait for relief to arrive. Something was calling me back to Raven's Hollow. I'd never been there consciously, but I found myself dreaming about that massive tree, feeling an overwhelming urge to return. It was like having a song stuck in your head, except it was a place stuck in my mind, a location that seemed to pulse with significance I couldn't understand. I lasted 2 days before I gave in. I hiked to Raven's Hollow with every intention of solving the mystery of my lost time. I brought extra cameras, GPS trackers, even a digital voice recorder to document everything I experienced. I was determined to maintain conscious awareness of every moment, to catch myself in the act of whatever had been happening to my memory. Grove was exactly as it appeared in the photographs, a cathedral of ancient trees with trunks so massive that 10 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. The forest floor was carpeted with centuries of fallen needles, creating a silence so complete it felt like being inside a vast, living church. There, in the center of the grove, was the tree from my photograph. Even larger in person, it rose so high that its crown disappeared into the canopy above. its bark scarred by centuries of weather, but somehow still vital, still growing. As I approached it, I began to understand why the Tlingit called these places memory trees. Because, as my hand touched the bark, exactly as it had in the photograph I didn't remember taking, the memories came flooding back. But they weren't my memories. Suddenly recalled being a young Tlingit man named Kaha, hunting in these forests 300 years ago. I remembered the weight of a traditional cedar hat on my head, the feel of a hand-carved paddle in my hands as I navigated the intricate waterways of the archipelago. I experienced his entire life in moments, his childhood in a winter village, his marriage ceremony, the birth of his children, his death from a disease brought by Russian traders. I was someone else, Maria Santos, a Spanish explorer's wife who had been shipwrecked on these shores in 1794. I felt her desperation as she searched for fresh water, her relief at finding a stream near this very grove, her gradual acceptance that rescue would never come. I lived her 17 years of solitude in the wilderness, watching the seasons change from the shelter of a crude cabin built near the memory trees. The experiences continued, each one complete and vivid. I was a Russian fur trader named Dmitry Volkov, a Norwegian fisherman called Lars Hansen, a Chinese gold prospector who called himself Lucky Chen. I was dozens of people across centuries, all of whom had found their way to this grove, all of whom had touched this tree, all of whom had left their memories behind when they died. But I was also still Alina, still aware of my own identity, even as these foreign memories flooded through me. And gradually, I began to understand what was happening. The tree wasn't stealing memories, it was preserving them. Every person who had ever died in these forests, everyone whose final thoughts had been of home or family or unfinished business, had somehow had those memories absorbed by these ancient trees. Grove was a library of human experience, centuries of lives preserved in living wood. The Tlingit had known this, had considered it sacred, because it was literally the resting place of their ancestors' thoughts and dreams. And people like me, people who spent too much time alone among these trees, gradually became conduits for those preserved memories. Memory lapses I'd been experiencing weren't blackouts. They were periods when other people's memories were so strong that they temporarily overrode my own consciousness. I hadn't hiked to Raven's Hollow because I was being controlled by some external force. I'd come here because Kahat remembered this place as sacred, because Maria had found peace here, because dozens of others had left psychic impressions so strong that they could influence the living. As this understanding crystallized, I realized I had a choice to make. I could leave, return to the ranger station, and gradually lose access to these incredible preserved memories as my contact with the grove diminished. Or I could stay, allow myself to become a permanent bridge between the living and the remembered dead, preserving not just their memories, but adding my own to the collection for future generations. I thought about Miguel, about his dementia, that had really been his mind trying to process centuries of foreign memories. I thought about how he tried to warn me, how his confused ramblings about trees stealing memories had actually been attempts to describe an experience that had no words in any modern language. I made my decision. I spent 3 more days in the grove, allowing myself to experience memory after memory, life after life. I learned the secret history of Southeast Alaska from the perspective of everyone who had ever died there. I felt the joy and sorrow of hundreds of people, experienced loves and losses that spanned centuries, gained wisdom from lives lived in conditions I could barely imagine. My backup finally arrived at the ranger station. They found detailed reports describing my experiences, but I wasn't there to explain them. My GPS tracker showed that I'd last been active in Raven's Hollow, and a search team was dispatched to find me. Found me sitting against the base of the great tree, apparently healthy, but completely unresponsive. I was transported to Anchorage for medical evaluation, where doctors diagnosed me with severe dissociative disorder brought on by isolation and stress. The official report stated that I'd suffered a complete psychological break and would require long-term care, but I wasn't broken. I was simply processing. My consciousness had become permanently linked to the memory grove, and while my body sat in a hospital bed, my mind was experiencing life after life, century after century of human experience preserved in living wood. Doctors said I might never recover, that my condition was similar to what they'd seen in Miguel Santos and several other rangers who had worked in the same sector over the years. They recommended that the area around Raven's Hollow be permanently restricted, that no Park Service personnel be allowed to work there alone. Sometimes, late at night when the hospital is quiet, I become Alina again for a few moments, and during those times, I remember what I learned in the grove. That memory is the only true form of immortality, that every life matters because every experience adds to the sum total of human knowledge and understanding. Tlingit were right to call them memory trees. They're not stealing anything. They're preserving everything. Every joy, every sorrow, every moment of wonder or discovery or love that has ever been experienced in those forests is kept safe in their rings of growth, waiting for someone with the right sensitivity to access them. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain this to anyone, or if my conscious awareness will continue to surface long enough to try. But if you ever find yourself working alone in the deep forests of Alaska, if you start experiencing memory lapses or finding evidence of activities you don't remember, pay attention to what the trees are trying to show you. Memories they carry aren't just random remnants of the past. They're the preserved wisdom of everyone who came before us. And maybe, if you're brave enough to let them in, you'll understand that some things are worth remembering forever, even if it means forgetting who you used to be. Trees remember everything, and now so do I.
My name is Connor, and I worked as a wilderness rescue coordinator in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas for 15 years. When people go missing in the wilderness, I'm one of the people they call to find them. Over the years, I've seen everything from simple cases of hikers getting turned around to more complex situations involving injuries, equipment failures, and severe weather. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what I discovered during the autumn of 2017. It started with a pattern that took me months to recognize. Every October, around the time of the harvest moon, we'd get a spike in missing person reports. Not unusual by itself, fall is a popular hiking season, and the changing leaves draw thousands of visitors to the Ozarks. But these weren't typical missing hiker cases. The people who disappeared during harvest moon season were different. They were experienced outdoors people, not the kind of folks who get lost easily. Local hunters who'd been working these hills their entire lives, seasoned backpackers with military training, park rangers and wildlife biologists who knew the forest better than anyone. Most disturbing of all, when we did find them, and we didn't always, they were discovered in locations that made no logical sense. Places that would have required days of difficult hiking to reach, far from where they'd last been seen, often without any of their gear or supplies. The few survivors we recovered were always found in the same condition: dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from what doctors diagnosed as severe psychological trauma. They'd babble about rituals and ceremonies, about being chosen for something important, about ancient obligations that had to be fulfilled. Most were hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation and never fully recovered their mental clarity. I started keeping my own records, tracking the disappearances and looking for connections the official reports missed. What I discovered was a pattern going back decades, possibly centuries. Every year during Harvest Moon, people vanished into the Ozark wilderness, and every year a few of them would turn up in impossible locations, changed in ways that made them no longer quite human. The breakthrough came in September 2017, when I was contacted by Dr. Margaret Whitfield, an anthropologist from the University of Arkansas who'd been researching historical settlement patterns in the Ozarks. She'd found references in 19th century documents to something called the harvest obligation, a ritual that early settlers claimed was necessary to ensure the fertility of the land and the success of their crops. The documents were vague about the specific nature of the ritual, but they consistently mentioned the participants being taken to sacred caves deep in the forest, places where the old ones still dreamed, and where the boundary between the living world and the sleeping world was thinnest. Dr. Whitfield had dismissed these accounts as folklore until she started correlating them with modern missing person reports. The timing matched perfectly. Harvest Moon disappearances going back over 150 years with the same patterns of experienced outdoors people vanishing and occasionally being found in remote locations in an altered mental state. She proposed a joint investigation, combining her historical research with my practical knowledge of the forest. We would spend the weeks leading up to the 2017 Harvest Moon establishing observation posts in areas where the disappearances had been most frequent, hoping to either document the phenomenon or debunk it entirely.
I should have said no. I should have filed her request through official channels and let someone else handle it. But after years of searching for people who vanished without explanation, finding survivors who spoke of ceremonies and rituals in voices that didn't quite sound like their own anymore, I needed to know what was really happening in those woods. We set up our base camp in early October, about 5 miles from the nearest road in a section of forest that had seen 3 disappearances over the past decade. Dr. Whitfield brought archaeological equipment and historical maps showing the locations of abandoned settlements and known cave systems. I brought wilderness survival gear and communication equipment, plus enough supplies to sustain us for 2 weeks. For the first week, nothing unusual happened. We explored several cave systems, documented some interesting geological formations, and Dr. Whitfield found evidence of historical settlement that supported her research. It felt like a routine camping trip with an academic purpose. That changed on October 11th, 3 days before the full moon. I was checking our perimeter security when I noticed footprints around our campsite. Bare feet, adult-sized, but with an unusual gait that suggested the person had been walking on uneven ground for a very long time. The prints appeared and disappeared randomly, as if whoever made them had been moving through the trees rather than along the ground. That night, we heard the singing. It started just after midnight, a low humming that seemed to come from the forest itself rather than from any specific direction. The melody was unfamiliar, but somehow achingly beautiful. The kind of music that makes you feel homesick for a place you've never been. Dr. Whitfield was excited, convinced we were finally documenting evidence of the ritual activities she'd been researching. But something about the singing filled me with dread. It didn't sound entirely human. There were harmonies and tonal qualities that seemed impossible for human voices to produce. The next night, the singing was closer and more complex, with multiple voices weaving together in patterns that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper in the brain. I found myself wanting to follow the sound, to find its source and join whatever ceremony was producing such achingly beautiful music. Dr. Whitfield was even more affected. She'd started sleepwalking, and I'd found her twice standing at the edge of our camp, facing the forest with a dreamy expression, swaying slightly in rhythm with the distant singing. When I woke her, she claimed no memory of leaving her tent. On the night of October 13th, the eve of the harvest moon,
the singing became irresistible. I awoke around 2 a.m. to find Dr. Whitfield's tent empty and her sleeping bag cold. Following her footprints by flashlight, I tracked her deeper into the forest than we'd ever explored, through terrain that became increasingly difficult and eventually required actual climbing skills to navigate. The singing grew louder as I followed her trail, and gradually I began to make out words, not in English or any language I recognized, but somehow comprehensible anyway. They were calling to the earth, asking it to wake up and receive offerings, promising sustenance in exchange for continued fertility and protection. After nearly 2 hours of tracking, I found Dr. Whitfield standing in a natural amphitheater formed by limestone cliffs and overgrown with ancient oak trees. She wasn't alone.
There were maybe 30 people arranged in a rough circle around the clearing, all of them swaying and humming in perfect harmony. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. I recognized some of them. There was Jim Morrison, a local hunting guide who'd gone missing 3 years earlier. Sarah Chen, a geology student who disappeared while doing research for her thesis the previous autumn. Mark Rodriguez, a park ranger from my own district who'd vanished during a routine patrol. They were all there. All the missing people from Harvest Moon seasons going back years. But they were changed. Their skin had a grayish pallor and their eyes reflected light like an animal's. They moved with perfect synchronization, as if they were all part of the same organism, all controlled by the same will. And in the center of the circle was something that wasn't quite human anymore. It had been human once. I could see traces of familiar features, remnants of clothing that suggested it had once been a hiker or camper like any other. But years of whatever ritual transformation had taken place here had changed it into something else. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers extended into root-like appendages that disappeared into the earth. Its face was serene but alien, with eyes that held depths that seemed to go on forever. The thing in the center turned those impossible eyes toward me and smiled with what might have been recognition. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that resonated in my chest cavity. "Connor," it said, and somehow I knew it had been waiting for me specifically, that my years of searching for the missing had marked me as someone special, someone worthy of understanding the truth. "You've been looking for us for so long. Now you can see why we had to stay." Dr. Whitfield turned toward me then, and I saw that her eyes had already begun to change, taking on that same reflective quality as the others. She smiled with perfect peace and contentment. "It's beautiful, Connor," she said in a voice that layered multiple tones together like a chord. "They're not missing, they're transformed. The earth needs caretakers, guardians, who can hear its needs and respond to them. We're being chosen to serve something far more important than our individual lives." The central figure gestured toward the ground, and I could see that the entire clearing was connected by a network of root-like growths that pulsed with a faint bioluminescence. The missing people weren't just standing in the circle, they were plugged into it, their transformed bodies serving as conduits between human consciousness and whatever ancient intelligence lived in the earth beneath our feet. "The old ones made a bargain," the central figure continued, its voice now speaking directly inside my head. "In exchange for the land's fertility, for successful crops and abundant game, they agreed to provide caretakers, humans who would serve as intermediaries, who would help the sleeping earth understand the needs of the living world above." I understood then what had really happened to all the missing people. They hadn't been killed or kidnapped. They'd been recruited, transformed into something between human and plant, their consciousness preserved but fundamentally altered, their bodies modified to serve as biological interfaces with an intelligence that predated human civilization by millions of years. And now, they wanted me to join them. The singing intensified, and I felt my own will beginning to dissolve under its influence. Part of me wanted to accept, to let go of the burden of searching for people who weren't really lost, to become part of something larger and more meaningful than my individual existence. But another part of me, the part that had spent 15 years bringing lost people home to their families,
rebelled against the idea of giving up my humanity, no matter how beautiful the alternative might be. I ran. I turned and crashed through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me, ignoring branches that tore at my clothes and rocks that bloodied my hands and knees. Behind me, the singing continued, now tinged with what might have been disappointment, but no anger or pursuit. I made it back to our base camp and immediately began packing. I destroyed Dr. Whitfield's research notes, erased her digital files, and removed every trace of our investigation. Then I hiked out of the forest and drove straight to the nearest state police station. The official report stated that Dr. Margaret Whitfield had become disoriented during a nighttime exploration and fallen into an unmapped sinkhole. Her body was never recovered despite extensive search efforts. I was commended for my rescue attempts and granted extended leave to recover from the trauma of losing a research partner. I never went back to that part of the Ozarks, and I transferred to a different district the following spring. But every October, when the harvest moon rises full and bright, I monitor the missing person reports from my old territory. The disappearances continue. Experienced hikers, local hunters, park rangers, they still vanish during harvest moon season and occasionally turn up in impossible locations, changed in ways that medical science can't explain. The official reports always blame psychological trauma, but I know better. The earth is still hungry, and the harvest obligation still needs to be fulfilled. Somewhere in those ancient hills, the transformed caretakers continue their vigil, serving as intermediaries between our world and something far older and stranger than we can imagine. Dr. Whitfield's research is gone, destroyed to prevent anyone else from following her path. But the truth remains hidden in the deep forests, where the old ones still dream and the boundary between the living world and the sleeping world grows thin. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Ozarks during October, if you hear singing that seems to come from the earth itself, if you feel an overwhelming urge to follow beautiful music into the deep forest, resist, turn around, and leave immediately. Because some callings are too ancient and too powerful to refuse. And once you've heard the harvest song, part of you will always be listening for it, waiting for the night when you finally stop running toward home and start walking towards something far stranger and more permanent. The earth remembers its bargains, and it's always looking for new caretakers to tend the boundary between what we know and what we're better off not understanding. Don't let curiosity make you the next person to discover what that really means.